It's encouraging that Mr. Trump wants to engage in diplomacy, which the Biden administration did not. But it is a fact that you cannot regain at the negotiating table what you have decisively lost on the battlefield. And that is Mr. Putin's point of view. He's correct. Whatever happens is going to have to reflect the realities on the battlefield. I would hope that he would be willing to compromise. I think it's asking a bit much to have the Ukrainians abandon those parts of eastern and southern Ukraine that the Russians have yet to take. And I don't know whether, how many Russian speakers there were there. There are 2.5, 3 million Ukrainian Russian speakers who've taken refuge and asylum in Russia. It wasn't just Ukrainians fleeing to the west from the Russians. It was Russian-speaking Ukrainians fleeing from Ukrainians and going to Russia. And this needs to get settled. It's not going to be easy. And the notion that somehow or other the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans are cooperating with each other against American dominance of the world just for the hell of it is ridiculous. We've basically pushed them in that together. We have maximum pressure on all of them. We are at economic war with China. We're at technological war with China. We have very strong sanctions against Russia. We have maximum pressure on North Korea and on Iran. And we are colluding with Israel in a threat to attack Iran. So, they come together. It's a defensive move. It's not an instance of aggression. And I don't think that it is correct at all that the Chinese weigh what they should do about Taiwan in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, or the Iranians weigh what's happening in West Asia in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, or the North Koreans who've been basically bottled up behind the DMZ for 70 years, somehow think that Ukraine is anything but a wonderful training ground for their troops who are gaining combat experience that they hadn't had for 70 years. And like the Russians, are likely to emerge from that much more competent and stronger. So I think
doesn't it diminish NATO's credibility when all of these would-be opponents see them just completely living in an unrealistic frame of work, and that they think that even though they have demonstrable catastrophic failure for 3 straight years of trying everything in the world to reverse this, are still talking on the eve of the end of the war like they're going to strengthen Ukraine. And you said just before we came on the air here that this is actually not even an issue about giving them weapons. There's nobody to use them on the other side. And actually, here's what Secretary of State Rubio said during his confirmation hearing.
The problem that Ukraine is facing is not that they're running out of money, it's that they're running out of Ukrainians. There's a size differential here that's important. Now, what Vladimir Putin has done is unacceptable. There's no doubt about it. But this war has to end. And I think it should be the official policy of the United States that we want to see it end. Now, what that master plan looks like is going to be hard work. This is not going to be an easy endeavor. But it's going to require bold diplomacy. And my hope is that it could begin with some ceasefire. And we're going to have, in order to achieve objectives like the one that needs to occur in Ukraine, it is important for everyone to be realistic. There will have to be concessions made by the Russian Federation, but also by the Ukrainians, and the United States lend itself there. It's also important that there be some balance on both sides. In essence, it will be difficult to achieve this objective of a ceasefire and ultimately a peace settlement unless both sides have leverage.
That's a very sensible statement. And the essence of it is that we're all going to have to compromise. And we're all going to have to give the other side face. To the extent we can. But you cannot ignore the fact that something over 1 million men and women have died in this war. We don't know how many. And you can't ignore the fact that the Russian speakers in Ukraine were severely persecuted. 15,000 or so of them were killed in the civil war that broke out after Ukraine underwent its American-sponsored coup d'etat in 2014, and passed laws banning the use of Russian for official purposes in Ukraine. These are serious issues. You asked earlier about how the negotiations would proceed. there are multiple parties here. Certainly, the issue of where the Ukrainian border with Russia is and how the Russian speakers in Ukraine are protected are related issues. The issue of whether the Russian speakers in Ukraine have rights is of concern to Hungarians. There are 150,000 Hungarian speakers in Ukraine who've also been deprived of their right to use the language. There's a lesser number of Romanian speakers. There are Polish speakers, and there are other minorities. And this is going to have to be addressed in the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe context. The rules in Europe preclude the sort of discrimination that Ukraine has practiced. And the Russians, having signed off on Minsk and letting Russian-speaking areas remain part of Ukraine, and then seeing that subverted, are not going to buy a pig in a poke. If you get into the question of the broader security system in Europe, which we have to do, it's not just a question of Ukraine declaring neutrality and no intention to join NATO. You have to involve the major European powers, Germany, France, Italy, perhaps others, and NATO and the United States with the Russians. And so these are very complicated issues. And the notion, I disagree with Secretary of State Rubio, that you have to have a ceasefire in order to get talking, because as I said, that's not going to happen. And basically you get a ceasefire as a result of an agreement on basic principles, like the ones that the Chinese put forward. But we're a long way from that. We're still seeing everybody posture, somehow or other. If you did a decision tree, this is, you put a box in there that says a miracle happens here. Well, there's no miracle going to happen.
It's an empty box at the moment, and it's made more difficult. That I showed you that comment from Mark Rutte a minute ago. In that same conversation, he actually turns things around and says that they tried to negotiate in good faith in the past at the Minsk agreements, but it was the Russians that violated that and refused to do anything about it. So he's even saying, we can't go back to anything like that. But I'm just thinking, Mr. Ambassador, looking back on that, can you imagine if that was actually implemented back in the 2015 or any time before 2022? All of these million people that you just talked about would still be alive.
I agree. There was a demand for implementation of Minsk. There was a demand for a discussion of European security architecture. And there was a demand for Ukraine to return to neutrality as part of the process. There was the model of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, which established a neutral, democratic, prosperous Austria with guaranteed rights for minorities. That remains a model for Ukraine. But that Ukraine is going to be a rump Ukraine because of Ukrainian actions, including the trashing of the Minsk agreements, including the bombardment of the Russian-speaking areas, and including some pogroms against Russian speakers in places which aren't even in contention, like Odessa.
Odessa, yeah.
War goes on long enough, Odessa will be in contention. And Ukraine risks losing its access to the Black Sea.
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to ask you as we close out this particular portion of the conversation here. If Trump tries to stick to these things that he's talking about doing so far, which is, going down a path of seeking a ceasefire, trying to have some sort of ultimatum given to the Russians, and if Putin just says, yeah, I'm not going to give in to that, and just keeps going, what is Trump going to do next?
Well, I hope he will have his conversation with Mr. Putin and his conversation with Xi Jinping, and that he will change course. He's nothing if not flexible and unpredictable. So I don't think he needs to be wedded to a strategy that will fail. I think he will look for one that can succeed, and we should all support that effort. He should have our encouragement for that. because this war, as Rubio said, has to end. It can't go on. And the notion that the Biden administration peddled that this war somehow was a great thing for Allied unity in NATO is belied by the fact that a number of NATO allies are very clearly at odds with this policy and recognize that Europe can't be at peace, it can't be stable, unless there's an agreed relationship between Europeans, including Russians, and other Europeans. And if the United States is against that, then we are basically an enemy of peace, and the result will be the prolongation of the war. And Europe has a habit of starting world wars when it gets divided. This is not a trivial thing, even if you don't consider the nuclear dimension, which is there.